Making sure this is live. So, one moment, please. Okay. So, one. Okay. Yeah, I'm live. Um. So this is going to be a video refreshing myself with a certain material that I'm writing over. So I was going through my notes initially, and I wanted to start off talking about where I'm trying to kind of pinpoint where to start writing chapter one. I have a lot of notes. I have a lot of things that I've detailed over. And one of the things that I wanted to start off with, at least for me, was my involvement in certain 4chan activity. Looks terrible in writing because the cable's not long enough. Oh no. But with 4chan came a lot of stuff that was born from the hacker movement and hacker groups in general. With a lot of the stuff that came about from 2011. So that's kind of what we're going to start off with. 2011. And in 2011, there was a lot of things that were occurring, or a lot of it started in 2008, 2007, and kind of the primary start of where this started was a war against Scientology. And it started with a group of people that looked like, see if I could get that, like this. This is an Occupy Wall Street poster, but before it got and built up to this point in time where it was about Occupy Wall Street and bankers and all this other stuff, it started off with initially just a social movement that was against Scientology and some of the practices that they were doing. Now people understand Scientology to be somewhat of a cult, but back in those days, not so much. Because you had a lot of campaigning from celebrity to, like, the main celebrity was Tom Cruise, but at least people knew at the time that there was a problem amongst that. And I should probably erase this. I wanted to see if I could use Krita, but I don't have any comfortable way of doing this. So I'm going to start off with a video that I always love sharing because he was somebody who was on the ground and was noticing things that I was noticing as well because I was a part of this. And if you kind of look at what 4chan is now, it is a mere shell of what it used to be. Back during this time period, I want to say 2000, this was 11 years ago, so 2010, 4chan at the time was considered a leftist movement. It was considered a very libertarian. It was considered a champion of the left, not the right. That came later, but that was for different reasons. So I'm gonna play some of this video.
Interesting development because I was observing the anonymous campaign, and that's a very, very, very sophisticated internet campaign, which they call themselves anonymous. And then I observed the actual demonstrations, and I noticed that what appeared to be the original intent of the demonstrations was subverted. So instead of it being demonstrations against the Federal Reserve System and related international banking entities and the Council on Foreign Relations and so on, it suddenly became, through deliberate, strategic, organized efforts by very powerful groups, the elite, and we know who their names are, it became anti-bank demonstrations. It became pro-Obama demonstrations. And with the influx of the massive power of the unions, the nature and the content and the message of these demonstrations has been transformed. Instead of being a populist message or a libertarian message or a conservative message or even a constitutional message, it has been subtly transformed into a leftist socialist message. Now, I want to talk about something that I think is of great importance to you.
So, describing basically what I was describing. But during this point in time, it was very important because what he leaves out is the fact that the reason why all of this kind of started was because in 2000, I want to say 2007. Can you zoom in on this? It's rotation. Just zoom in. In 2007 to circa 2008, you had the financial crash. And a lot of people don't remember this financial crash, which was primarily through mortgages. A lot of it was through the housing sector. And something that gets really left out is how a lot of people, even my own mom, was affected with this financial crash. A lot of people lost their homes. They were in certain loans and in certain situations that left them in such a financial distress that they had to literally let go of properties. Some people to this day are still in debt. And during this time, a lot of people bought houses that were completely overpriced. And when the housing market crashed, they lost all of their money, or at least their loans were fixed at certain percentages. So if they bought a house that had a reasonable price that they could pay monthly, once the financial crash happened, it didn't work out that way anymore. Also, it was highly leveraged towards corporations. I was actually trying to look for some of these newscasts that were basically saying that even during this financial crisis, a lot of corporations basically dumped and fired huge portions of their workers. And the only reason why they did that was because they were trying to keep, what was it called? It was a financial relief bill that was essentially passed by Obama, where he basically bailed out all of these corporations. But what these corporations did was they fired their entire work pools, just so that they could keep the financial packages and basically distributed them to the top. I was also looking for a documentary that further elaborated this, but it's been so many years that I can't even remember the name of the documentary. Further moving on to this, people will say, what do you mean it was a sophisticated movement? It was sophisticated enough that you have the George Washington University that has complete detailing of protests that were leading up to this point in time. This was one of the posters, propaganda poster used by Anonymous to endorse Day of Rage. Anonymous to release a DDoS tool, which is a denial of service tool to the public called RefRef. This was basically an application that was used to disrupt certain online activity. Now, this is an unclassified document from the FBI themselves, because leading up to the movement, there weren't agents that were following protesters. Once they started getting a lot of traction and they started getting a lot more attention, that's kind of when all of these agencies kind of mobilized. And a big part of why that happened was this fucking guy. His name was The Real Sabu. Over 90,000 credit cards from LEA, journalist, intelligence community, and white hats leaked and used over $1 million in donations. He was somebody. His name was Xavier. I can't remember his name exactly, but I should have his Wikipedia pulled up. His name was Hector Monsegur. Hector Xavier was also known as Sabu. An American computer hacker and co-founder of the hacking group LulzSec. He wasn't necessarily a co-founder. He was just one of the idiots who didn't have a proper VPN. But by the time that he was discovered, he became an informant for the FBI, working with the agency for over 10 months to aid them in identifying other hackers from LulzSec. Now, during this 10th month period, he was acting as a instigator, somebody who was promoting, actively pushing the group to doing more and more outrageous shit like this. Basically, this is where the birth of doxing came about. This is where the initial stages of them turning from a non-violent, it was more of a, it was for the lulz. In reality, all of this was just to see how far we could get. There was no real malice. There was no real intention of getting violent or being beyond anything harmful to what we were trying to do. I should really state that I do not know how to hack. I do not know any. I don't know anything, right? I did not actively participate in any of this because if you kind of look into what happened to a lot of these people that were involved in this movement, they essentially ended up getting like over 124 years in prison. Like the judge purposefully threw years at all of the people that were involved in this. This was kind of like an international thing, so it wasn't necessarily just located in the US. But you did have a lot of people who were involved in this movement that just fell into having decades worth of prison sentencing thrown at you. And those are the ones that went to the public trials. There were a lot of hackers who were offered deals by, I want to say, we'll just call them agencies. Some of them were recruited by the CIA, others were recruited by the FBI, and a lot of these people were given breaks on their sentencing if they offered their time and services to the agencies themselves, which I'm pretty sure to this day they're still actively working a part of these agencies. But during this time, at least 2011, we also had people who were sympathetic. Now, here's what's left out of LulzSec. A lot of this was involved from LulzSec to 4chan, a hacking who's who. And this article basically somewhat details out. Circa 2003, emerges from 4chan. For years, the focus of its attacks to anti-music piracy bodies. So a lot of this started with, you had a lot of activity from certain music industries that were trying to actively fight online platforms that were distributing music. For those who are old enough, you remember LimeWire. For those who are even older than that, you remember Napster. Napster before it became what it is now. 2008, first high-profile crash target, the Church of Scientology. This is where we get Chanology. 2009, Project Chanology. The group surfaces again in support of pro-democracy movement during the disputed Iranian presidential elections. In 2010, you had redoubles its effort with attacks against companies perceived to be anti-WikiLeaks. And the reason why WikiLeaks and these Hacktivism members kind of co-allied is the fact that you had a lot of, we call them white hats. White hats are basically people who work at the behalf of, they're considered good, right? They're hackers. You know, if you kind of look at any police agency, they'll consider them criminals. But in reality, a white hat is basically somebody who hacks on the behalf of good, right? You have this ideology that comes from Dungeons and Dragons, where you have a neutral white hat, which is basically good, and then you have the opposite side, which is evil. But there are more sides to this because you could be chaotic good, at the same time you could be neutral evil, and there's a whole ideology behind that, but that's not the point here. You had a lot of intersecting people who were a part of these movements, because there weren't that many people who actively knew how to hack at this time. The internet was still in a very brand new state, and you didn't really have a lot of these hacker courts that we have now that will basically throw the book at you. They'll throw life at you if you try to hack within US to US, which kind of comes with the ideology of, if you want to be a hacker nowadays, you need zombie computers outside of America in order to then hack back into America. And a lot of that comes down to the prison program, which is an NSA sponsored program where server to server, there are I can't remember what you call them, but they're basically machines that capture information coming and going. And they'll basically detail them out to your IP address, to your home address, et cetera, et cetera. But that technology wasn't fully fleshed out during these periods of time. There's a really great TED talk where Edward Snowden kind of talks about how the NSA kind of arm locked a lot of internet providers at the time to signing up to the prison program. But if you watch this channel, I do not like that guy for a variety of different reasons. To move forward from that, here we have dozens of Twitter accounts have been shut down by the social network, but more keep popping up. Now, this is why Twitter is in the state that it's in right now. You know, with Elon Musk taking over it, with him addressing the bot issues. I also found a really great article that's a part of the National Library of Medicine. How this is here, I don't know, but this is a scholarly journal that describes exactly this. And this scholarly journal specifically talks about the social movement of Occupy Wall Street. The American anti-capitalist movement, Occupy Wall Street, is remarkable for the prominent role social media, and in particular Twitter, played in facilitating communication amongst its participants. Now, this was kind of the first time where you had people really learn and really understand the role that certain trends could be used, basically social media trends. This was the very first conception of them being hijacked, because during this time, Twitter was such an early state that they didn't have algorithms to steer public opinion in any one way. It was still brand new. These ideas weren't fully fleshed out, so you had a lot of people from 4chan who kind of knew how to make memes and how to make certain propaganda, we'll call it that, that could steer people in certain directions. And it was quite some time because you had a lot of dumb memes that were coming about. One of the most popular ones was when you, to charge your iPhone, you would put it in the microwave. That came from 4chan. A lot of these memes and a lot of this social media hacking kind of came from these early moments in time. Now, Twitter represented a valuable resource for supporting the movement's political and social objectives. In time, however, activity on the platform substantially diminished, mirroring the fading prominence of protest action on the ground. In light of this decline, we seek to understand more about the population from which Occupy drew its support, and specifically whether these individuals exhibited changes in behavior or social connectivity over the course of the movement's evolution. You basically have a scholarly journal on the National Library of Medicine that goes into detail and goes into creating a full, a dissertation, a study, talking about Occupy Wall Street. Now, this journal was written in 2013. The timing of this matters specifically for Cambridge Analytica, but that's in a different video. Right now, it's just talking about hacktivism, 2011 to 2016. Because a lot of what happened during this time in Occupy Wall Street, a lot of the social movement. Now, I actually don't have a picture of this, but during Occupy Wall Street, let me see if I can find it. There was a popular slogan where, right, I can't afford a lobbyist. I am the 99%. We had a lot of, see if I can find it. Right, Chase, give us our money back. 92.7 billion, and that was actually a number, well, at least that's what Chase was bailed out with. Dear 1%, we fell asleep for a while, just woke up, sincerely the 99%. You had a lot of rhetoric, a lot of, what do I want to call this? You had a lot of people waking up to the fact that the free market, our media, you had a lot of people wake up to the notion that there was a very small group of people that got to dictate lobbyist groups, that got to dictate what bills were passed, what certain things were happening, which is why I brought up this guy, because he brings it up where the movement itself was hijacked. And instead of it being an anti-banker, an anti-Fed, an anti-Senate movement, it became later a pro-Obama movement. It became a pro-this. And the reason why it matters that it became a pro-Obama movement is for the fact that he was the one that essentially passed the bill to bail out these failing economic sectors, from the housing market to banks to, I think some of the most egregious ones were like Walgreens. Walgreens was actually one of the companies that got bailed out during this time. And you have a lot of articles that still kind of bring up this. Anonymous comes out in the open. An Arab Spring style protest over the abuse of corruption of corporations, banks, and governments. Now, the Arab Spring was also something that 4chan kind of facilitated in. They also had a hand to play in this, because if we look at Egypt, we saw Egypt at this time lose internet connection. But because you had a lot of anonymous people that knew how to get to the internet still, they taught individuals in that country how to turn on the internet back on. And this is kind of the birth of hacktivism. Let's see where I could go back to. You all, oh yeah, this is from Cambridge University Press. E-bandits in global activism, WikiLeaks, Anonymous, and the politics of no one. Now, the reason why it says no one is because these movements were essentially leadershipless. There wasn't a spokesman. There wasn't somebody that was primarily the head of Hydra. It was just a movement where people were educating themselves in what was occurring at the time. So, with a lot of these corporations getting bailed out, a lot of people started recognizing that Wall Street was kind of the dictator in a lot of what was going on politically. Something one of my favorite comedians says is, the economy is upstream to politics. So if we know how a river works, a river only goes in one direction. Water only flows in one direction. So when you hear that statement of Wall Street is basically upstream to politics, it just basically says follow the money. The people who issue the money, the people who maintain the money or maintain the economy or facilitate lobbyists, and lobbyists are just groups of lawyers who will constantly go to Washington, D.C. to speak to senators, representatives, and they'll detail them out like, hey, I work on behalf of this company and I want to facilitate that this company gets these certain things done so that their business can flow easier. Which is why it goes down to the original picture, which is, I can't afford a lobbyist. I am the 99%. Going further into this, people always ask me, why does this matter? Why does this conspiracy theory matter? And a lot of it matters because if we're always focused on our day-to-day lives, if we always, kind of funny, I could lose my job for having a voice. That's why a lot of these people control our livelihoods. They control our means of supporting ourselves. And because people are always sloshed in our day-to-day lives, we completely ignore what's going on the larger picture scale. This is one of the main reasons why, if you look at Africa, you have a lot of miners who are being exploited for cobalt mining. You have a lot of workers in China who are literal slaves for, like, Apple, for example, where you have people who will throw themselves out of the building because their work conditions are so terrible that that's the only choice that they have. Workforce. This was kind of what I'm trying to say is, in 2011, you had a lot of people wake up to the fact that, how do I say this? It's a very difficult thing to describe. You have different subset classes of workers. And the more that you put them in situations where they can only really see in a narrow vision, they will not care about their external reality. And this is why Occupy Wall Street became a problem. Because it was the first time you had a group of people recognize, wait a minute, my actions, my ignorance, and my tunneled reality is causing all of these problems around the world. And, it's kind of why Subversion, which is why I don't like Tim Pool, because he literally calls his show Subnet or whatever. You have a lot of this where Occupy Wall Street created the conditions for 2016 to come about. Now, I should explain that because I was a part of the generation that was going into college around 2011 to 2012, which internally, inside, while I was in college, I was watching the education system be changed. There were certain ideologies that were then being put back into the forefront, which is what I call identitarianism. The importance of an identity over everything else. And it's kind of where you saw third wave, this is what we call third wave feminism, come about. But what they realized that you can only do so much with third wave feminism, that they needed something else. They needed a more protected class of individuals to further progress certain ideologies. Now, the reason why this matters is because when you put people in blinders and you put them in a tunneled reality, they will only focus on the things that affect them. They will not focus on anything further than that, because to them it's like, why does this matter? It'll always come down to, why does this matter? I can only focus on what I have power over, which puts them in a bicurious situation where they won't extrapolate their actions to the dominoing effect of what occurs afterwards. So, for example, when people just focus on getting the new iPhone, they don't realize that they're putting themselves in the situation where they're constantly reoccurring debt. This is why phones come out new every year, because you don't pay for the phone up front. In reality, you pay for the phone in your bill, which is just a form of extrapolating wealth out of your pocket, right? Instead of buying a used phone, well, this gets more into a specific subset. Right? This is a science. This is all detailed out. Just the way that... All right, so I was looking at a script of mine, and the script is basically an alien race that comes to Earth, and their whole purpose is, should we communicate to them? They sent an agent to Earth to figure out an intelligence report, and we could call it an ecology report, where they were just trying to detail out what are the limitations of this race, and is it worthwhile, or is it worth the risk of us communicating to them? And somewhere along that part of them trying to figure out if they're worthy of doing it, there's a joke that says, can't remember it off the top of my head, but it's basically a joke where it describes that people are too focused on the material side of things that they're not willing to see far enough into the future for them to for them to be a part of the Galactic Federation. And that was just a joke, because if you get into the conspiracy world, the Galactic Federation is a bit of a meme amongst certain truth movement communities. Not the point. But where did I want to go with this? Twitter. And I also brought up how subset groups of people are only focused on their social media accounts. They're only focused on what I have and what I don't have, right? This is kind of why we're running into a certain scenario with relationships between men and women, because at least science-wise, Okay, that goes into a whole other bag of worms and a whole other video about how human life has been largely, it's been narrowed down to a science. They understand how our brain works. They understand how our dopamine receptors work. They understand that how when we're watching certain material, when we're watching certain news, or when we're watching certain commercials, they understand the biochemical reactions that occur in our brain when we see certain colors, when we see certain themes, when we see a certain kind of language being used. Um, it is basically have it's been narrowed down to a science to figure out how to use all of these elements into making, like, let's say, a music video, and how that music video will then trigger certain receptors in our brain that will release certain chemicals that will then create a certain reaction inside of our bodies that will then create a certain what do you want to call it, expectation, a certain response from us to either identify, to sympathize, or to desire, or to fear, or to all of these, like, all of our senses have been essentially hijacked, and this is all finely tuned science. And the reason why you can literally assume that is because look at how much money is pumped into marketing firms, not just marketing firms, but the industry of Hollywood itself. How much of it goes into staging, coloring, what do you call the people that get to decide what you wear, uh, creating posters, etc., etc. This is all a finely tuned science. What else was I gonna show? Don't really have much to show on that part, but with, should just start here. With what happened in the advent of 2011, you essentially had a variety of things happen. You had a social group called Occupy come about, which brought to the attention, well, it extrapolated an issue. And the issue wasn't necessarily towards the people, it was more focused on the people that ran certain industries. You had banks, you had lobbyist groups. I don't even know how to spell lobbyist groups. I'm a bit of a retard. I'm a bit stupid. You had lobby groups. You had politicians. Now, the reason why politicians matter in this situation is because these are the people that are in control of our civil services. And by civil services, they literally get to control and dictate a variety of different things that occur in our lives. They get to control regulations. They get to control, I want to say the roads, I want to say public infrastructure. But if you kind of look at our infrastructure as it is now, it hasn't changed. And they by no means are incentivized to improving our conditions in life. That's a whole other bag of worms. But Occupy Wall Street essentially directed the attention towards these groups. And then, you get into the media, you get into social media platforms, you get into, in this case, we get Twitter, but let's not go there. And that was just one aspect of things. But how did these things become a problem? Well, Occupy was motivated by what we call hackers. And hackers had access to something that was super important. And we call those emails. And this is where you had the birth of, not the birth of, but you had hackers were facilitating emails to people like WikiLeaks. WikiLeaks, now here's where people just completely forget. How do hackers have the ability to send emails or data? Actually, you should just put data. How did they have the ability to send data to WikiLeaks? Well, the connecting factor here was somebody very famous. His name was Kim. Hold on. Kim.com. Kim.com is essentially the guy who owned Mega Upload. Now, I understand this web goes deep if I really want to detail it all out. But how do you stop, right? There's no infrastructure for this yet. There's no algorithms. There's no meaningful way to stop these people yet. We'll leave it at that. But hackers essentially started doing this because they were activists. They had no intention of gaining money from it. They had no intention of getting fame from it. It was primarily done out of a good and honest place because they wanted to see the world be a better place. They hated corruption. They hated corporations. They hated the activity of who? The banks, the lobbyist groups, politicians, the media, social media. Get where this is all going? But either way, 2011 gave birth to Occupy, which gave birth to hackers. Now, hackers were essentially put in a situation where they gave birth to what we call the PRISM program, which is NSA. Now, there's a big reason why the NSA matters in all this. The NSA is essentially the largest data collection firm ever. Now, all of this problem that stemmed from Occupy gave birth to the NSA PRISM program. But what they did inadvertently was, how do you operate all this? How do you go through all of this information? You need people. Now, in needing people, right, you need a workforce. And in using this workforce, you need eyes. You need people. And when you have people, you have not activists, but you have people who have, what do we call, pre-programming. But who works at the NSA? Primarily officers, or what we call military personnel. Now, this becomes a problem because of what is their ideology? What are their belief systems? What do they believe in? What do they believe in? What kind of people are they? Do they have good traits or bad traits? What fuels these people? Now, the reason why this matters is because primarily the people who join military are what? Conservatives. Now, with conservative values, it kind of gets mixed up all over the place because, as we think of conservatives now, is not what conservatives were from the years 2011 to 2016. Now, remember, this is just a 5-year period. We went from 2011, from having Occupy, to 2016 to having what? Trump. Now, this goes into a whole other web of theories that I just cannot get into because we'll go back to ideology. We'll go back to the belief system. Now, with ideology, you also get birth to belief system. Belief systems. Now, with belief systems, that basically dictates decision making. I don't even know how to spell decisions. I'm a bit of a retard, but let's forget that, right? They have decision making capabilities. What are the decisions that they're making? Now, even prior to 2011, you already had people working inside of these government organizations. So, with WikiLeaks, we know that they were being fed data. Who was feeding this data? Actually, I just realized that I have data over here. So, WikiLeaks was being given emails and data. Who was giving this data to them? Well, that's where you get into people like, in 2016, what was his name? Seth. Poor Seth. Seth Rich. Now, Seth Rich obviously is from 2016, so we can't really use his name. But we know for a fact that emails were being given to WikiLeaks, and we can assume that they were white hats, or what we can call them, whistleblowers. Now, the reason why we call them whistleblowers is because this comes from the muckraker era, which is, I want to say, 1940s era style journalism, where you had people working inside of certain industries that were blowing the whistle, that there were certain practices amongst certain corporations, certain businesses that were, like, hey, this person's doing something wrong. I need to report this to, at that time, it was the FDA. But I think at that time they were called the Bureau of Chemistry. That's not important right now. It's a whole other bag of worms. But these emails, this data from white hats and whistleblowers was given to WikiLeaks. And that's a problem. That's a giant problem. Because you have people who are, well, actually, why is this not writing? You have people who are either government workers, corporate workers, or people inside of the, what do you call it, email chain? Right? Not many people would know what that is, because who the fuck uses email that way anymore? Email chains. You had people who were a part of this data infrastructure, these email structure, that were literally feeding tons of information to WikiLeaks. They were just, hey, I'm looking at this movement, right? A lot of these people who were just normal people, average people, who were watching these activists in Occupy Wall Street, and they were like, yo, right? Because they were watching the news. You had normal people watch the news, and the news was trying to ridicule, trying to belittle Occupy. They were trying to be like, oh, look at these group of idiots, look at these group of hippies. But you had people in the internal structure, right? We can call this the internal structure. Internal structure of these businesses. I don't even know. My brain. You had people inside of the internal structure of these businesses, of these corporations, and they were like, yo, right? You had all of these workers looking at Occupy, and they were like, yo, they're not wrong. I'm working on behalf of this agency, or I'm working on behalf of this corporation, and that's exactly what we did. So you had a lot of people kind of internalizing this and being like, yo, they actually have the right to stand on what they're protesting. They're not wrong. Which led to a bigger problem. You had sympathy. You had sympathy for Occupy, which led the movement to grow even bigger. And you have to understand this from the perspective of somebody who's trying to maintain the corporation status quo. They're trying to maintain the modus operandi, which is profit. At the end of the day, it's profit. She's going to start again. Let's just make a new layer. Turn this one off. So, back to 2011. You had Occupy, the movement, and you had workers. Average, normal, everyday people who worked for workers, for corporations, or we'll just say corporations. We can also say international structures. Now, the reason why international structures work is because you have to remember, sometimes these workers have valuable skills that allow them to go outside of the country, that allow them to facilitate contracts, deals. In a weird way, this kind of business model gave birth to what we call non-disclosure agreements. Basically, non-disclosure agreements, which basically you sign away the right to ever speak about anything that you do for certain businesses. That became very important during these years because you had a lot of corporations figure out that, oh, We can't just allow our workers to get to quit or to fire them, and we need a way to shut them up. We need a way to make sure that they don't ever talk about what they did inside of these businesses or corporations. This gets into a very giant bag of worms, because essentially Occupy gave birth to 2016. Yeah, 2016. Which, the reason why this matters is because what happened in 2016? The Trump era. Now, the Trump era matters because, again, this all comes back to workers. This all comes back to the fact that you had normal, everyday people that were affected by the events that arose from 2011. We'll get back more into that. But during Occupy, we had a restructuring of the education system. The education system. Now, I can say that because you had identity politics insert themselves, because you can't have people, right? They were trying to put a stop to people to understanding politics in the way that it was understood during the time of Occupy Wall Street. Because during the time of Occupy Wall Street, they were still teaching business and politics and all of these financial systems, and they were teaching them in such a way that it was kind of blunt. It was just blunt information. So people were able to put two and two together of, oh, the reason why business practices are this way is because politics is facilitating a lot of these economic sectors. Either way. So instead of rerouting that focus, they reinserted identity politics to make sure that, oh, this gave birth to what? Racism. Racism in the workforce. Because now it took away from the understanding of, like, don't get me wrong, racism is more of a social dynamic thing. It's more of a what do you call it? Sociology, the study of groups of people. That's more in line of that. But because you had this new education system teaching identity politics, it essentially sugarcoated the entire issue into being, instead of it being a social issue, right, a social communicative issue, it became a structural issue, where it said all problems are because of racism, instead of it being the reality of the situation. Right, there are other factors that lead into racism, but not everything is because, you know what I mean? Because if you actually have this conversation and you kind of talk it out, you'd figure out that the system itself facilitates the way we behave, the way we act, the way we live our lives. But in getting to that, we have to talk about our social makeup. We have to talk about our psychological makeup. And we have to understand how our psychological makeup is created out of the experiences that we have in our lives. And that's too complicated to talk about right now. Because again, we're talking about the event called Occupy Wall Street. Now, where was I going with this? With identity politics. We could go back to the pro-Obama administration stuff, but I kind of want to get to a video that's kind of where it all started, that I posted on my Instagram. Why did I keep typing the letter B? Oh, my Instagram. I don't know what's going to pop up, so let's hope it's nothing embarrassing. Okay, either way. Yeah, here we go.
Obama was made president for two reasons. Domestically, he was made president to force alternative sexual lifestyles onto black children, sexual confusion as a means of population control. And internationally, he was made president to go to Africa and to force AFRICOM there, to build military bases all throughout the continent. And guess what? There's been about 6 coups in Africa over the past year, and every single coup was in a country with a United States military base. No coincidence. America only practices democracy when the person who wins the election has an agenda that is in the interest of America. Charlemagne, you can be elected president, but if your agenda is not in the interest of the white power structure, you will be overthrown. Democracy only lasts as long as the person winning the election is favorable to the agenda of the power structure.
Now, what is left out of that about alternative sexual lifestyles is that that wasn't necessarily what he was put in place for. That was a reaction of what came out of Occupy. Because with identity politics, it essentially created a special class of people. Now, special class doesn't mean I don't know how to speak. It's more of a protected class. Actually, that's a better thing to put. Beep, 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 beep. Not special class. A protected class. Now, the reason why they have to be protected is because it shields them from being criticized, from being ridiculed for having wrongful ideology. Now, during this time, keep in mind, this protected class was born in 2011 to 2014. What occurred during this time period is something very important, which is the reclassification, or we'll say reclassification of something very important in the field of psychology. And you want to know what that was? What was it called? It's the booklet that basically describes mental health issues. It was reclassification of psychology, which is reclassifying the, what is it called? Either way, the reclassifying of mental illness. Now, this is important. The reclassifying of mental illness, which you get into gender dysphoria, you get into certain aspects of schizophrenia. Either way, this all just goes back to beep, 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 identity politics. Because now, identity politics created the protected class. And with the reclassification of those psychological disorders, you can't criticize these people. Because now, another thing that came about this is the homeless problem. And us having a lot more homeless on the streets that have serious mental issues. Well, with the reclassification of certain mental issues, guess what? Now those people who are homeless and out in the streets acting all funny don't have, how do I say this? There used to be a lot of social services that were offered to people with serious mental issues. But because they had reclassified a lot of these mental issues, they can't be considered for these programs anymore, essentially leaving them out in the streets. And it's kind of why we're literally witnessing a rise of people just abandoned on the street. A lot of it came from the fact that they reclassified certain mental illnesses, which excludes them from certain social programs. That's a whole other issue, right? Because these are just the after effects of what happened in 2011. Now, in 2012, from 2012 to 2014, when I was in school, and with the reclassifying of the education system, now we have a connecting dot here between these 2 years. What happened was, you have the new workforce, right? So I want to say 2012, 2013, we had a lot of 20-year-olds 20-year-olds who now are 30-year-olds. And these people who were indoctrinated or taught during this specific change in era are now running the modern infrastructure. Essentially, by modern infrastructure, I'm talking about the jobs. More specifically, this is very specific. The people who are running lawyer firms, the people who are running the media, the people who are running social media accounts, people who are in, we can say, the music industry, etc., etc. The list goes on and on. Because in reality, what I'm focusing on, all of these people have one thing in common. They became the new, what do I want to say? They're the new workforce. They're essentially the people that are leading our social platforms. But it's not that they're leading our social platforms. It's that because they went to school, they went to college during the time that they were kind of introducing all of this new identity politics, you basically created identity politics. I don't even know why I put a C there. New identity politics. They essentially became candidates. And what did they become candidates for? Well, everything. These candidates are basically people you can call your managers. People who you can call your, what do you call them? Superintendents? And because they have the ideology that came about from the modern university structure, they are now the leading, you want to call them, they're the people that basically get to decide where the gears go. They're the people that get to decide who gets hired, who doesn't get hired. Oh, this actually kind of leads into more 2016 problems. But these are all superficial problems. Now, the reason why, well, it's not that they're superficial in the sense of it's just stuff you see on the surface. It's more of the fact that they look like superficial problems, but in reality, they're very integral to the problems that were birthed later, which gave birth to, again, 2016, to the Trump era, etc., etc. A perfect example of this is, I want to say, the years of 2017 to 2018, which you had people like Jordan Peterson. What was the other meme? I don't even know. You had people like Jordan Peterson who came about during this era. You had the people who called themselves the intellectual dark something. I don't even remember what they call themselves. You basically had social justice warriors. Now, remember, you wouldn't have social justice warriors if the reclassification of the education system didn't happen. Them reclassifying and restructuring the modern university program basically created this wave of social justice warriors. Because you can't start a social movement, you can't start something that didn't begin somewhere else. All of these are just domino effects of what occurs. But with social justice warriors, they were essentially birthed during my era. Because from 2017 to 2018, you had people who were, how old was I, 25? Give or take. You had basically the new subset era of educators. And those educators, well, at the time they weren't educators. They were called, I remember these people specifically. Either way, social justice warriors, or as I call them, Che Guevaras. Che Guevaras. Now, I call them Che Guevaras because they're essentially call them civil servant protesters, because essentially they're working on the behalf of the new movement. They're working on the behalf, like, these people get picked to then influence or be introduced to the new people, the new youngins that are coming in, who are then influencing the new generation of people who carry this new ideology. Right? Because how many people have you seen with the Che Guevara shirt ever since these years? It's increased. There's a reason for that. But either way, ideological, we'll call them ideological warriors. Because essentially they're the ones, this is what we call the death by 1,000 paper cuts. If everybody around you says the same thing, believes the same thing, and immerses themselves in the same belief structure, well, what do you get? You get a simulated reality. Because, right, if you kind of follow the domino effect, you'd realize that the reality around you is it's a facade. It's not very real. But this is why it's called the death by 1,000 paper cuts. Just because it's one little paper cut. Oh, this one person shares the same ideology. But when you are immersed in it so thoroughly, you begin to realize that the immersion itself is simulated, because they introduced it very slowly. Right? Very slowly. It was a very drip feed problem. But during this era, let's see if we could, I don't even know. You had a lot of YouTube clips. You had a lot of YouTube clips of these people freaking out. Freak out. We'll call them moments. Now, the reason why that matters is because it is a demonstrable thing you could look at, identify, and realize that there is a trend. There is something occurring here. And with these freak out moments, you began to see the ignorance. You began to see I don't want to call it just ignorance. It's just, you started seeing people who shared a certain belief system that had no real basis in any logical fact. Now, that's going to fucking trigger a lot of fucking people, because social justice warriors are closely associated with the LGBT movement. Now, LGBT ... because I don't know all the fucking things. Now, these people were birthed from the protected class of individuals. This protected class of individuals came about from where? Identity politics. Because now you had a new group of people who care about identity. Now, to classify this in an even better way, think of sports teams. How many people are super diehard fans of certain sports teams? And think about how blind they get over their sports team, over their team of, how could you say that about my favorite team? Don't you know that we got this new player, this or that? Like, there's an immersion that comes from picking a team, picking a side. This gets into, Roman Colosseum, picking your favorite this or that, and then problems. Just problems come from not seeing the logical side of things. Because you're so immersed in the identity that you put all logic aside and you just immerse yourself in protecting your team, protecting your side. Now, I'm not belittling LGBTQ or whatever the fuck. It's the fact that they picked a team. They picked a side. During 2017 to 2018, we also had the media effect. We'll call it media effect. which the media effect was basically creating Trump. The media effect created the conservative problem. It created bigotry. Not to say bigotry doesn't exist. It's just it exemplified a certain example of bigotry. It exemplified and portrayed bigotry in a very specific way. And, you know, kind of funny with this when you think about bigotry, because it gave birth to, I think it's called Turning Point USA, which then created the versus side of social justice warriors. Because now you had an enemy, right? Anytime you can create two sides of an argument, notice that the media will then, well, it's not the media, it's lobbyist groups. What do I want to call them? Not lobbyist groups. You essentially have people who will throw money at organizations like Turning Point USA. It's kind of like the WWE effect, right? Both of these people share something in common, and that's called the WWE effect. The WWE effect is essentially you now control both sides of the story. You get to control the versus thing, right? Oh, Ben Shapiro's going to appear at this university, right? In appearing at that university, it creates this eternal rift between two different sides of people, which essentially creates the gladiator effect, right? Now you have your favorite fighter fighting some other fighter, and it creates a show. It creates this facade of a thing, either way. And it's not just Turning Point USA. You also had people like Crowder, people like Milo, people like and you had other people that were just kind of thrown into this fire because if you had substantial backing or if you played your part, you got to exist. If you stopped playing your part and you started breaking down the paradigm that you were in, they would make you an enemy, burn your identity, and kind of throw you away. Either way, back to the media effect of 2017 to 2018, social justice warriors. 2017, 2018, Trump became a problem, conservatives became a problem, bigotry was at an all-time high, but all of this came from the media effect. And the media effect is essentially, right, if the media doesn't talk about it, it's not real. Right? If it's not an exemplified problem in media, the problem doesn't exist. I'm going to keep buying my iPhone because if it's out of my mind that there are Chinese slave workers, I don't really care about it. Huge problem, actually. How long do I have? I have an hour and 8 minutes talking about all this. Jeez. This is why writing a book about all this is such a problem. Because in order to talk about one subject, you have to talk about another subject. And in order to exemplify that subject, you need to go into psychology and certain subsectors of science that, whatever. Either way, the media effect also comes from the psychological understanding of humanity. Right? The media, by and far, has the largest understanding of how we react to hearing certain news. Right? And the reason why you could say that the media effect, they know this, is because when the media was making fun, when the media was making fun of Occupy Wall Street, they realized they created sympathy. And they created sympathy towards the workers, towards people that were inside of these corporations, towards people that were inside of these international structures of these corporations. They realized, oh fuck, we can't just talk about issues. We can't just talk about certain things because then it'll highlight an importance to it. It gives it authenticity. authenticity. What I call it is the hallmark effect. Now, hallmark, not in the cards that you give to people, but like, oh, happy holidays, or will you be my Valentine? None of that. By hallmark effect, a hallmark back in the old days during medieval times was essentially a stamp, right? If the king gave a decree, the king would make a decree, sign it at the bottom, and he would put his stamp to validate that piece of parchment, that piece of paper. And in validating that, it essentially gave certain rights. Like, people don't know this, but if you were a part of a kingdom, or if you were a vassal, somebody that worked on behalf of the king, you could not leave the country. You could not leave. And if you did, they would hunt you down. But there were passports that were essentially given out to certain vassals that allowed them to leave the country. Emissaries. Because back in those days, certain skill sets were very valuable. And in having that value, they couldn't just lose their valuable citizen to another nation, or to another country, or to another baron, or to another person that controlled the different area, because it would give them the advantage and this and that. That's where you get headhunting from. Or I think the way corporations call it now is corporations have a name for it. When they have a valuable worker, other corporations will then go look for that worker and offer them a better deal. Can't remember what it's called. There is a name for it though. Either way, media effect goes back. Media effect gives authenticity, and it gives the hallmark. The hallmark being, oh, this is a real issue. Like, this is why we have a lot of people who will hinge on Fauci. Like, if the CDC doesn't say it, or if Fauci doesn't say it on television, X, Y, or Z, it's not believable. It's because it's the media effect. It comes from the fact that, what is it? I think it's been 70 years. It's a 70-year practice and tradition that has been developed in the modern world, where if we see it on television, there's a certain authenticity that we associate with it. But bing, back to 2017, 2018, back to 2011. The media plays a huge part in how we view the world and how we authenticate certain stuff. And there's also the fact that, going back to the education system, authenticity also comes from the university. Comes from the universities. It comes from degrees. It comes from MDs. It comes from MDs. It comes from people who have, right? What do you call it? Degrees. Yeah, I don't know why I was thinking of that again. It comes from universities. It comes from degrees. It comes from MDs. It comes from the fact that there are people who dedicate their lives in certain fields. Now, why does this matter? Now, these people are a revolving door. There are new people who come out of universities with these degrees, which means this is where you get your workforce. So as long as you control the education, or what I call worldview, of the people who go into this structure, this infrastructure, this system, you essentially feed back into the authenticity, the hallmark, because out of sight, out of mind. If they never saw it, if it was a topic that they never learned, or if it was a concept, an idea that these people don't know, it's not their fault. Like, you really can't blame these university people for this problem, because at the end of the day, they weren't taught it. They don't know about it. It was information, ideas, and concepts that weren't introduced to them, which goes back into, or it's not that it goes back into, when you control the worldview of people and when you control the worldview of this workforce, you essentially have candidates. Where did I write candidates? Candidates, managers, superintendents, right? Because if they have I was going to say, I don't even know why I was going to spell that way. If you have people with a narrow worldview, right, because of their education, they essentially, if they don't know it, out of sight, out of mind, they have a narrow view of the world, a narrow worldview. They essentially, I don't want to say it like this, but you create drones. You create NPCs, non-player characters, because they consider themselves educated. They consider themselves above everyone else. I have that piece of paper that validates my work of field. I have this piece of paper that says that I am an educated individual amongst these certain topics, which you go back into, which feeds into this ideological warriors. You have people who will ignore everything else because they developed the identity. Wait, they developed the identity of being educated. And because they wear that on themselves, they wear that color, they wear that team, they will refuse to see their own ignorance. Which, you know, we can use examples of people stabbing each other at like baseball games and stuff like that, because they drown themselves in the fact that, well, I studied so many years in this field. How dare you say that I don't know this, I don't know that? And again, this is exasperated with the media effect. Because if the media didn't say it, there's no authenticity, there's no hallmark, right? And then you get into news networks, this or that. And then with the lack of reading, oh boy, here we go with this one. Nobody reads the news anymore. Nobody will read a newspaper, let alone go to WashingtonPress.com or any of these newspapers anymore. They won't. They'll just read the headline. They won't actually read any of the material that's within the article to see if they're right or wrong. They'll just read the headline and run with it. Further leading into the problem of authenticity and hallmarks. Right? This is like a feedback system that just looped itself into whatever destruction this is. But all of this came from 2011. Because in 2011, you had a president who had, well, I can't say that it was Obama's idea. In reality, he was just listening to orders. It benefited the power structure at that time. Another one. So the power structure. Power structure, 2011. Right? The power structure had a problem. Oops. Power structure had a problem. It was called Occupy, which was groups of individuals who realized the problem of Wall Street and politics. And they were like, damn, how did Occupy create this problem for us? And it's just like, oh, education. Education. They were educated people that didn't come to this conclusion because of conspiracy theories. They came to this conclusion because they themselves were birthed out of this education system, that they realized the problems of money, power, and influence, especially when you kind of get into like diplomacy. Either way. So when Wall Street was like, well, how do we fix this education problem? They redirected everyone's attention to identity. Or at least, I can't say it was purposeful in the sense that they knew people were just going to roll with this, but they knew that they had to subvert expectations. Right? Subverting expectations, which just essentially means that instead of you clearly seeing your problem, they direct your attention to a different problem. Right? Instead of saying that corporations, did I even write this? So in subverting these expectations, instead of it being recognized that corporations and politics were causing the world's problems, they basically were like, this is not the problem. Ugh. This is not the problem. Racism, bigotry, this is the problem. And it's just like, well, who creates the, right? And then, if anybody's smart enough, if this is a problem, what creates this problem in the workforce? Well, corporation standards, right? Like, if they were smart enough, they would recognize that this comes from where our livelihoods come from. Like, they would understand that something creates the standard of our lives. But, it's not corporations that are the problem. It's the workforce. People. People are the problem. Subverting expectations, right? So instead of them being taught correctly in the sense that how our infrastructure actually works. Like, there's a great story that I have when I had to explain to somebody our 3 branches of government. They were like, Trump is going to destroy everything. I had to remind them that we have 3 branches of government: the executive, the Senate, and the House of Representatives. If these 3 houses do not work together, policies can't be passed. You can keep in check each branch of government. And they looked at me and were like, well, that's not what the news said. I was taken back. I was just like, and you're my boss? Like, that's all I thought at the time, was like, you have a college diploma. You're supposed to be more educated than I am. And you don't know that we have 3 branches of government? It was just something so basic that I learned in high school. I was just really confused. Like, how the fuck? What happened here? Like, that's why during 2016, I didn't see Trump as a problem. Because the way I thought about it was, we have 3 branches of government and it'll keep him in check. If he really is going to be a dictator, I think we're going to have people with sense. And right, me fully knowing about lobbyist groups, me fully knowing about how funding worked, because I was a part of Occupy, so I knew the internal structure of things. I was just like, well, if he's a problem, which he is, because if you looked at the news and how they were portraying him, they clearly had a big problem with him. They knew they could just kick him out. All they had to do was wait 4 years. Either way, it's a whole other bag of worms. Because racism, bigotry, that's the real problem. It's not the fact that we have power-hungry corporations that pay oodles of money to lobbyist groups to dictate politics, to dictate standardizations of the workforce, standardizations of our education system. Or, of course, none of that's the problem. Either way, I'm going to leave that here because I'm going to rewatch this video. Because this was just me jotting down ideas, which I need to save this file. But yeah, this was just essentially me jotting down ideas and my realm of understanding of things, so I could progress forward with trying to write chapter 1 of my book. Because I have so much information that I don't necessarily know where to start. It's all very convoluted. And you know what I mean? Because I've just been noticing trends. But, you know, it's kind of where you have to disseminate your intelligence. By intelligence, I mean it in the sense of intelligence that I've gathered and how it all correlates to one another and how it's created the certain environment that we're currently in right now. Um, my mind is currently blown at the moment because I just tried narrowing down this problem for 2011 to 2016, and even then I had a huge problem trying to narrow it down because in order for you to understand the present, you need to understand the past. And in understanding the past, you have to understand the actors. You have to understand the population, the expectations, what was occurring, what was important to people during these times. What were the things of value that created certain social movements that led to certain decisions in politics. And the reason why politics matters is because you have to remember the news, politicians, journalists, and we'll call it government, requires the need of your permission in order to execute certain ideas. So when it came down to LGBTQ, they needed the importance of the gay community to be in the minds of people in order for them to progress with this new education problem. By education problem, I mean, how do we make this such an important topic that we can then pass bills and use government money in order to facilitate this new agenda amongst our universities? And one of the big things that I remember when I was in high school was they had given us funding for my school, which is a private charter school, where we took field trips to Sacramento, which is what do you call it? That's where our town hall is for California, where we then spoke to politicians, right? But creating a show, a facade, where look at all of these high school students that came to visit us here in Sacramento. They must really care about the gay community. Not to belittle the community, but it required a special class of individual. It required a special. It required a protected class of citizen in order to demonstrate on a local, municipal, statewide, or national-wide level of interest amongst the people, where enough people would then go to their town halls and then beg their politicians, hey, we need funding for this, or hey, we need money, or we need new social activist groups in order to progress forward this new ideology. Now, with the introduction of that ideology, it introduced what I call social justice warriors in a weird way, because those were the new Che Guevaras. Those were the new people. I just realized this is probably what's being seen on YouTube. Oh no. Wait, what is being seen on YouTube? Okay, no, never mind. I had to correct. Essentially, with the changing of the focus of topic and the changing of the importance, or at least what's relevant in the minds of people, that is what essentially progressed forward the new Che Guevaras, the new candidates that we currently have, the new kind of the new topic, the new issue. It's all a dominoing effect. And that's why politics is so fucking complicated for people to understand, because it all derives from somewhere. And if you look at it from the way I see it, it derived from the education system from my generation, because they had to train a certain group of people to find importance in this certain topic that would then lead these group of people to make career choices. And when they made these career choices, because there were things that they held in of value and moved them forward in their career choices that then allowed them to become lawyers, allowed them to become activists, allowed them to become politicians. This is what I call the workforce. You can't have an agenda and not have workers for it. But in creating workers for it, it comes from somewhere. Well, where were these topics? Where did the interest come from? And understanding human beings is a science, but when you understand what people hold of importance, it comes from past experiences. And in understanding their past experiences, you can kind of develop a model of understanding of humanity and kind of work backwards from there and understand that the interest, or at least the protected status of LGBTQ, came from somewhere. And that was somewhat of a reaction to a social movement that came about from certain policies that were, certain policies that came about during an era where people started really caring about what government was doing. But in order to subvert that, they created a boogeyman from 4chan. They created a boogeyman with Xavier, Hector, and they created a scapegoat in order to leave that part of that protest in the past and socially engineered it into identity politics. But whatever. My name was Ramirez. This was a long ass video, and I'll probably do a part 2 that's more refined and that has a bit more information than what this is.